everybody. Uh, from the number of people here and the cars outside, we all know we have a rock star within us, Jairam Ramesh. And among the intellectuals who are supposed to be doing thinking work and writing and so on, he puts us all to shame. I think he's been averaging 1 or 2 books a year. Jairam? Sometimes on land, sometimes on forest, and now a biography. He's one of the most prolific and articulate members of parliament that I know. I've been working, fighting, engaging, laughing, and all that with him for several years now. And irrespective of where you come from or what you do, what I find in Jairam is that he first listens to what you have to say, even if it is an opposing ideology, and then brings out arguments to support where he comes from and why. Often off the record, he has even condemned his own people or his own policies. But on record, whenever he says something, it is backed by facts, it is backed by logic, it is backed by a rigorous understanding of the subject. Otherwise, he doesn't even get into it. He was among the people who were part of the campaign in the 2004 and 2009 elections. And now that elections are coming, I'm sure you will have several questions around that. Although the focus of this morning's meeting is his latest book, Intertwined Lives. It's a biography of P.N. Haksar. I think viewed through the prism of Indira Gandhi. And from what I have just gathered by reading bits and little bits here and there, it seems to be that there is like Indira Gandhi was not the sole reason for the policies that she made or where she took the country towards. And there was a mind behind that, and that is P.N. Haksar, among several others. I welcome Jairam here, and I welcome all of you. So over to you, Jairam.
Normally, politicians come late, but I've actually come much earlier. And I find neither Ashok nor Barkha, they may be on the way. But since I'm sure all of you are hard pressed for time, we can start. Yeah. And then, maybe I can say a few remarks which I was supposed to make when they were here, and then they can join. Well, this is a biography of P.N. Haksar, who arguably was India's most influential and powerful civil servant. He was Indira Gandhi's secretary from May 67 to January of 1973, first secretary and then principal secretary. And these were the 5.5 years in which he exercised awesome power. From 1973 to 1977, he continued to be working with Indira Gandhi as her special envoy, as deputy chairman of the Planning Commission. And these were the 4 years in which he did not have power, but he had influence. And from 77 till 1984, when Indira Gandhi passes away, he neither had power nor he had influence, but he had voice. So he used the bully pulpit, so to speak, for writing, for speaking, for raising issues that were then engaging the country's attention, issues like Punjab, issues of Jammu and Kashmir, and so on and so forth. There was one brief return to influence in the mid-80s when Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, as Prime Minister, sent Mr. Haksar as special envoy to China in May of 1987 to begin the process of reconciliation and normalization of bilateral relations. And it is this Haksar visit of May 1987 that finally led to Mr. Gandhi's historic visit to Beijing in December of 1988. So this is a biography of this man, a man who was Indira Gandhi's alter ego. He was her ideological anchor at a time when the Prime Minister herself was very cautious, very tentative, very uncertain. He was in power at a most turbulent period of India's political history. This was the period that saw the nationalization of banks, that saw the abolition of privy purses and princely privileges, that saw the spectacular mandate that Indira Gandhi got in March of 1971. It saw the emergence of an independent sovereign Bangladesh and the war with Pakistan in December of 1971. It saw the Simla Agreement of July 1972, and subsequently the New Delhi Agreement with Pakistan and the Bangladesh Agreement with Pakistan and Bangladesh on prisoners of war and the humanitarian issues out of the 1971 war. So here was a very unusual civil servant who crossed the Lakshman Rekha of being a civil servant. He was really an ideologue. He was a political ideologue. He was not a politician in the strict sense of the term. He never held a political office, but he provided the prime minister with a constant stream of political advice, which led ultimately, of course, to the ideological split in the Congress party in November of 1969, an event that had great consequences for India's politics. Mr. Haksar played not just a political role, but he played a very important role in the building of India's scientific capability, something that is not often recognized. He was the man, for example, who identified Satish Dhawan as chairman of the Indian Space Research Organization at a time when Dr. Vikram Sarabhai had just passed away. He was a man who recognized Dr. Homi Setna as chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. He was a man who mentored Dr. M.S. Swaminathan, the father of our Green Revolution. And of course, Mr. Haksar was the man who got the chief economic advisor into the Ministry of Finance in 1972, the chief economic advisor who went on to become the Prime Minister of India in 2004. He mentored Dr. Manmohan Singh as well. So he was a man who mentored scientists, technologists, economists, and a variety of other people. He was an unrepentant Marxist throughout his life. He was a communist. He was a card-carrying member of the CPI. He was secretary of the CPI in Nagpur in 1942, 1943. But then resigned from the party, but continued his intellectual links with the party. He remained an unrepentant ideologue. He remained, as I said, a strong proponent of the public sector, a strong proponent of ties with the USSR and the Comecon countries, deeply suspicious of the United States, not as a country, but deeply suspicious of the United States political establishment, having gone through the Nixon-Kissinger experience of 1971. Now, why did I write this book? Apart from the fact that he was a very influential personality and a very influential figure at a most tumultuous time. Well, the reason why I wrote this book is simply because Mr. Haksar left behind an extraordinary treasure trove of papers, personal papers. Whatever he read, whatever he spoke, whatever he thought, he put down on a piece of paper, most un-Indian like. He believed in the written word. I think he was more English in that sense of the term. It was more like Nehru, actually, in that regard. And we started without you, Barkha, and Ashok. So the main reason that has made this biography possible is the availability of primary archival material. These are papers available in the public domain, largely in the Nehru Memorial Library, some of them in the National Archives, others in archives across the world. Biography writing does not have an intellectual tradition in this country. We write hagiographies, or we either make our leaders into gods and goddesses, or we turn them into devils and villains. But writing biography based on primary material is a very rare instance. Gopal's 3-volume biography of Nehru and Gopal's own biography of his father, Dr. Radhakrishnan, of course, are exceptions to this rule. But as a rule, historians have shied away from biographies based on primary material. Most of our biographies are either based on oral history, or on memories, or on recollections, or on interviews, or journalistic accounts of events as they unfold. And so the real reason why I was able to write this book is because there are thousands and thousands of pages, literally, waiting to have been excavated at the Tin Murti, at the Nehru Memorial Library. And actually, some professor at JNU or Delhi University should have written this book long before I did. But it speaks volumes of our intellectual life that nobody actually bothered to do so. So the availability of primary material was absolutely crucial. And the uniqueness of this material is that this is not after the event material. This is contemporaneous material. For example, the notes that I have quoted in the book on 1971, the historic year of 1971, was not notes prepared in 1972 or in 1973, but these are notes that are prepared as the crisis with East Pakistan and Pakistan is West Pakistan is emerging. So these are contemporaneous records. These are not after the event records, which can be very, very unreliable. So let me stop here because really this is supposed to be Barkha and Ashok who are going to be discussing. I just want to say that this was a remarkable man who worked for a remarkable lady, and they had an extraordinary relationship. They had a personal relationship going back to the 1930s, to the days in which they were in London together, uh, going through a progressive leftist phase. In the case of Mr. Haksar, a decidedly communist phase. And when all three, Feroz Gandhi, Indira Nehru, and Mr. Haksar, were all acolytes of Krishna Menon at the India League. So they went back 35 years. She plucked him out of diplomatic obscurity and gave him a pivotal position in her innermost orbit. And he used power with a very high minded sense of social purpose, with, of course, a very strong ideological tint. They were they drifted apart. We can discuss this later, why they drifted apart, why Mr. Huxley left in 1973. But I do want to end by saying that Mrs. Gandhi was decidedly the prime minister of the country. She was the politician, she was the political leader, she was the one in contact with the people of India. And the ideology that governed her, the ideology that made her the icon that we associate her with, had in large part much to do with Mr. Huxley's own contribution. So, in many ways, Mrs. Gandhi made Mr. Huxley possible, and Mr. Huxley made Indira Gandhi the icon possible. So, this is a symbiotic relationship. This was a Jugalbandi. So it's not nothing in this book takes away from Mrs. Gandhi's contributions. It only adds to her stature. So I think we can go back to the program as
I thought I was the add-on to you.
no.
Sorry,
The nation wants to know why you're late.
I don't answer to that particular line. My apologies for being late. Bad traffic on a rainy day. What Ashok and I agreed on was that instead of us making sort of long speeches or comments on a book that really is Jairam's sort of labor of love, if it's okay with both of you, we'll keep this interactive. And yeah, I think that will be more interesting for everybody. So I think having been up all night reading the book, what Jairam did not actually talk about is very interesting precursors to the kind of issues that are actually on on our front pages, on our prime time today. On page 84, open in front of me, is a letter that P.N. Haksar is in fact writing to Indira Gandhi, where he's talking about how the Congress must not be overwhelmed by the cow and its dung, and how they must actually look for a different symbol, the tractor. And that's a debate in another context and another time, but it seems interestingly sort of prescient about the kind of debates, identity politics, what is the Congress's positioning vis-a-vis those kind of overwhelming electoral and social pressures. There is a very, very interesting portrait that emerges of Sanjay Gandhi and Indira's soft corner for him, notwithstanding that she recognizes Rajiv Gandhi to be the more industrious son who's gone out and got a job Sanjay is clearly the problem child, but almost more beloved for that. And there is, of course, the rupture that takes place between Indira and P.N. Haksar. Uh, some would say over Sanjay Gandhi and his opposition to the big Maruti project and that operating from the Prime Minister's residence. And then, of course, there is the larger question that I think we must put on the table that P.N. Haksar has been described by Jairam as well as perhaps the most powerful bureaucrat that India has seen. And I think you said Brajesh Mishra is the only one you can think of who actually is a parallel. Is that really a good thing? Is centralization of power in one individual, two individuals, the Prime Minister and her principal secretary, really good for democracy? Because that centralization of power again is seen to be a parallel between the present Prime Minister and Mrs. Gandhi. So with those sort of broad comments, Ashok, if you'd like to just take an overview and then we'll open it up.
I must state up front, I have an official position and many
This
of
is
the
true.
questions I cannot answer. I would not want to get
You
into
are
it.
spared only
I'm
a
very
little
conscious
bit.
of that. I have read the book. I would want to leave a few comments on the book,
Yeah.
which, I'm sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah. Yeah, okay. So I would not want to get into the politics of, I leave that to Jairam. I'm here as a friend of ORF, and this is my old haunt, my old office, and maybe future as well. So, okay. I'm also here, more than that, as a Jairam, fully paid up Jairam Bhakt. Okay. Jairam and I first met each other in '96 when I was in India Today, and he became a columnist at India Today. Strangely enough, India Today's office was then right next to Pandit Brothers, which finds mention in the book. It was a shop owned by P.N. Haksar's uncle. His wife was, as I discovered, a 10% shareholder. And that book features in the context of the emergency. You must, all of you know the story or must read it. This book has taken me back to those India Today days and to Jairam's columns as Kautilya. Columns that were very informative, very knowledgeable, and taught me so much about, not about politics as much as how policy is shaped in India and about how government and society work in India. Those were remarkably non-judgmental columns. Jairam has his positions, but like in this book, he gives you enough material to form your own opinions. There is enough material in this book for a second book, which is an almost sycophantic account of Haksar. There is enough material in this book to write a critical book of Haksar. So in that sense, Jairam, congratulations. You've done a remarkable job. I've always believed you have your heart in the right place. Of course, there are differences in terms of the interpretation of the location of the right place. How does this book get interpreted? If I can just take 2 minutes here. One, I personally empathize with one line in the book. Haksar travails as a middle-aged lateral entrant into government, trying to find his way about. There was a personal sense of, while he tried to get his appointment letter, it took him a few weeks, it took me a little longer. The second, it can be seen as the high point of the leftist impact on Mrs. Gandhi's policies, late 60s, early 70s. Policy choices made at that period, some good, some which even Jairam recognizes perhaps should not have been made. And this can easily become a right versus left argument, which I think would be unfair to the book and unfair to the period and to history. Third, it actually tells you a lot about continuity. I mean, there's an interesting exchange between Haksar and Pandit Nehru in the 50s about which foreign journalists to allow into Kashmir and which journalists not to allow. And, that's dynamite. That whole, it can be used and reused for the next 20 years. There's also, in July 68, 50 years to the day, the Indian government gets very exercised because a Pakistani army delegation has landed up in the USSR to buy arms. So again, some things never change. Okay. And this time it's the Congress defending it, the BJP or the Chand Sangh attacking it. But more than anything, and of course, this is also a book about where does the civil servant in the highest positions in the country, where does his interaction with politics stop? I know Karan Thapa wrote a column on this saying we should have stopped much earlier than it did, but this is a much more complex dynamic which needs a greater understanding. It's not just a black and white understanding, and I'm sure there are many senior civil servants here, former civil servants here, who would have their own opinions. But for me, the key takeaway from this book is none of this. It's actually how statecraft and the practice of power by a political party, by a political tradition, is used to realize political goals. And in parallel, or almost uh, as, as a exercise in conflation, how there's an interplay between state, government, and party to further the party's relationship with power. This is not new. This happened in Mrs. Gandhi's period. It's beautifully captured because of the archival material Jairam has marshaled. Uh, but frankly, it's continued with governments before, even after. And sometimes I did wonder. I know this is a political point. I did wonder whether the whole use of the CFSA, the Congress Forum for Socialist Action, the 10 points, all of that. To me, it seemed like ideas which went into UPA 1 and the NAC almost. You could almost see a template. I mean, other traditions have used it in other ways. So I'm not trying to be political here, but I'm trying to say that there's some frameworks of statecraft which are almost constant and which are enormous learnings. So this book I would recommend to anyone who is interested in Indian statecraft and politics. Frankly, anyone who wants to practice Indian statecraft and politics, because there's enormous material here for all of us to learn from. I'd stop there.
Well, I think we can open it up for some conversations here on the panel. Jairam, let me start by asking you, I think there's also that sense of the legacy of Haksar. And, you write about how there's a kind of dwindling generation that even knows about him. And he does emerge as this extraordinary figure. But one thing that struck me is this sort of, till he falls out with Mrs. Gandhi, there's almost a sense of equality with which they converse, which I think, I found myself wondering, when was that point in Indian politics that the capacity for a bureaucrat to talk to the prime minister with such a sense of equality and confidence, when do you think that changed? And was there something about that time that made it possible?
Well, I just want to say two things before I address your question. First, this is not a judgmental book.
Right.
I don't write judgmental biographies. I believe that a biographer must maintain an arm's length relationship, let the reader decide for himself or herself, provide all the evidence, and I have scrupulously avoided judgments. Although here and there judgments are sprinkled, but really this is a narrative biography. This is not a judgmental biography. That's the number one. Number two, I have eschewed the normal tendency of becoming wise with the benefit of hindsight, because I don't think that we can divorce personalities from the historical context, from the political context, the historical context of the 60s and 70s, great political uncertainty, the loss of the Congress hegemony in the February 1967 elections, the devaluation drama of mid-1966 that created a huge crisis, a besieged Indira Gandhi, hemmed in by all sides, by the party bosses and the syndicate. I mean, these are all, a tentative Indira Gandhi who was new to the job. These are all factors that cannot be divorced from the times, and also a general economic consensus that the state was to be the answer to social and economic transformation. I mean, there was hardly one or two individuals in the 60s and 70s who would even use the word market, or would say liberalization, privatization, and globalization, which have become buzzwords now. Now, the answer to answer your question, Barkha, frankly, the one lesson that I learned from a year of obsession with Mr. Haksar is that his greatest ability was to speak truth to power. He spoke truth to Indira Gandhi when he was with her. He spoke truth to Indira Gandhi when he was away from her. He spoke truth to Mr. Rajiv Gandhi, on the defamation bill, on Shah Banu, and variety of cases. Of course, that time he was not in position to influence. It's really the period with Indira Gandhi that we are really concerned with. So his ability to speak to truth to power came from a long personal relationship with Indira Gandhi that goes back to the late 30s in London. It goes back to almost being part of an extended family. He was very close to her husband. He was the local guardian for her two sons in London from 1965 to 1967. He was a man of extraordinary intellectual integrity. Uh, I don't think that we have had a Haksar who could speak, who had the courage of his convictions to tell the prime minister whether the prime minister is wrong or prime minister is right. As I've said, the only other person who approximates Mr. Haksar in this regard is Mr. Brijesh Mishra. Unfortunately, the difference between Brijesh Mishra and Mr. Haksar is that Mr. Haksar left behind a written archive, and much of what Mr. Mishra would have told Mr. Vajpayee, unfortunately, is oral and has died with Mr. Mishra, and Mr. Vajpayee also doesn't have any written record. But going from from hearsay and talking to various people, Brijesh Mishra did have that type of a personal relationship with Vajpayee that enabled him to speak truth to power. The ability to speak truth to power comes from enormous self confidence. It comes from an ability, from a recognition that you have life outside the person in power. In fact, one of the things I say at the end of the book is that never judge a civil servant by his record in office. Judge a civil servant by how he manages to live life in retirement. Uh, when you don't have office, when you don't have a chair, when you don't have authority, when you don't have power, how do you adjust to this different world altogether? And I think it is this transition that Mr. Haksar managed. And the answer to your question is, I mean, I have seen many civil servants. Over the years, the ability to speak out and face the consequences of speaking out. Mr. Haksar spoke out on every occasion, and Mrs. Gandhi forgave him on every occasion except one. Except the Sanjay Gandhi occasion, I think he paid the price for it, but he knew he was paying the price for it, and he faced the price. It's difficult to find civil servants who have this ability, and I mean, there are odd civil servants, who will speak. You have an Ashok Khemka, who speaks his mind and he gets transferred 45 times in 20 years. You have an occasional Arun Bhatia, who spoke out. You have a Harsh Mandar who spoke. I mean, you have people, but speaking out to a prime minister, I mean, that's a completely different kettle of fish,
But for a moment, let's argue it from the other side. The enormous power that Haksar actually wielded, and there is this part in the book where you show how he was even involved in ticket distribution, right? And the example you cite is of Harbaksh Singh, General Harbaksh Singh, which again seemed to me like a precursor to all these army generals who now want to contest elections. But General Harbaksh Singh, hero of the 65 war, coming and wanting to contest an election and not being able to get Gyani Zail Singh to actually move the process to give him a ticket. Now, of course, because it's General Harbaksh Singh and Zail Singh, you find yourself siding with Harbaksh Singh. But the fact that there is a principal secretary in the PMO that is writing letters to the Prime Minister on ticket distribution, it gives you pause. Like, is there a danger to that sort of centralization of power?
Let me address this issue of centralization of power. In our political history, Nehru is an outlier. Nehru didn't have a Haksar, he didn't have anybody advising him. He was his own Haksar in many ways. So the Prime Minister's Secretariat comes into being with Lal Bahadur Shastri. When Mr. Shastri becomes Prime Minister in June of 1964, he appoints L.K. Jha as his secretary, and that's the beginning of the Prime Minister's Secretariat. The Prime Minister's Secretariat expands over a period of time. As long as Mr. Haksar was there, it remained a small, lean, mean Prime Minister's Secretariat, small quantitatively. However, let me address the question that you raised. Did he centralize authority? Did Indira Gandhi centralize authority? Well, remember the constellation around Indira Gandhi. Mohan Kumar Mangalam, Sardar Swaran Singh, Jagjeevan Ram, YB Chavan, KD Malavya, these were no pushovers. These were all strong ideological figures who had all strong ideologies. Then you had Mr. Haksar in the Prime Minister's Secretariat, the eyes and ears, the antenna, the arms, the brains of the Prime Minister. The evidence that I have seen, Barkha, does not lead to an unequivocal conclusion that he centralized power. I'm using the word centralized power. I mean, files had to be cleared by Mr. Haksar before the decisions were taken. That's not what the evidence reveals. There were occasions in which Mr. Haksar and the Foreign Office differed on appointments. There were occasions on which Mr. Haksar and the Finance Ministry differed on issues. But Mr. Haksar went through the process of, consultations, due diligence, and encouraged the Prime Minister actually to do so herself. I mean, here was a man who was decidedly left-wing, decidedly Marxist in his approach, who becomes the greatest champion of I.G. Patel, whose economic ideology, I.G. Patel almost became Finance Minister of India in 1991. He was Mr. Narasimha Rao's first choice as Finance Minister in 1991. And Mr. I.G. Patel would not have survived in the bureaucracy had it not been for the Chhatar Chaya of Mr. Haksar. So there are numerous, and the best example I can give you, Barkha, Mr. Haksar brings in P.N. Dhar into the Prime Minister's Secretariat. Now, one can say this is the Kashmiri Pandit mafia working, but Mr. Haksar is anything but Kashmiri. He doesn't speak the language. His first visit he makes to Kashmir is when he's 55 years old in 1968. But he brings P.N. Dhar because P.N. Dhar enjoys the credibility, he enjoys a relationship with Indira Gandhi, and he brings P.N. Dhar into the Prime Minister's Secretariat with the understanding, which he doesn't reveal to Mr. Dhar, that he would take over from Mr. Haksar. And here was a completely different poles apart. So, I don't think he centralized power, but he certainly made the Prime Minister's Secretariat very powerful. He made the Prime Minister's Secretariat the ideological fountainhead. It helped that the constellation around Indira Gandhi was on the same page as her. Mohan Kumar Ramanglam was left-wing, KD Malavya was left-wing, D.K. Barua was, we make fun of D.K. Barua, but D.K. Barua was a great scholar, a great, leftist ideologue. So you had people, Sardar Swaran Singh, you had Fakhruddin Alai Ahmad, YB Chavan, another great figure of progressive Indian politics. So, by the way, I must say that the other thing is, I would urge all of you, when you read the book, please do not draw contemporary conclusions from reading the book, because this is a trap we always what's happening today, does it have? I wrote this book to provide a snapshot image of India during a certain period,
but so much
it was I had no intention
so much of what
drawing
was
a parallel
happening then,
between Modi
that's fine, you
Modi
may not,
and
but so much of what was happening is still happening, right? Which is something that Ashok, even when it's about which foreign journalist should go to Kashmir, is a small example.
I'm talking about continuity in statecraft. I'm not talking about X versus Y.
But forget that. I'm not talking about
Our systems-
personalities. But let me get you in on that point. You said that the book for you was really an illustration on how decisions are taken, how policy is framed, how much of personality frames policy, how much of ideology frames policy, how long it takes for a decision to be taken. But you can't help but thinking, for example, Kashmir. When there's this whole conversation that's taking place on how to manage Kashmir, how to manage Sheikh Abdullah, how to manage Farooq Abdullah. I mean, you can't help but noticing that, X decades later, you're having an identical conversation in Delhi today. So it's very difficult to leave contemporary politics or the resonance that, a next generation may see out of the reading of the book.
There are two things here. One, there are some intractable problems where the Indian state has a position which gets nuance here and there, but there is a broad degree of continuity. Kashmir is one of them, actually. Okay, whether we agree, disagree, whatever, but it is true. Second, the larger point is more than individual policies. The process by which the engine of state moves, or by which statecraft is conducted, the rules, frankly, to somebody they've been immutable for years. Years ago, I saw Anthony and Cleopatra, and there's this sequence where the most powerful character in that film is actually Augustus Caesar, who's trying to get the Senate to agree to a war with Cleopatra, a war nobody wants. I mean, why are we going there to invade Egypt? But he almost creates a hysteria, step by step, and I don't think it's remarkably different with what Colin Powell did at the UN when he made a very persuasive case, if you remember. So there's some lessons which remain constants, and that is the fascinating part of as a student of politics. So I think Jairam is completely right about X and Y. And frankly, to contradict you at something you just said, when you're talking about bureaucrats talking straight to prime ministers, I don't think you can equate that with an Arun Bhatia or Ashok Khemka or something. That is a step. I think from my limited experience, I've served in government for 1 year, you've been there much longer, and others have spent a lifetime there. From my limited experience behind closed doors, people do speak. We don't get to see it outside, perhaps, but people do speak. We know Haksar spoke because he's left records. We don't know others spoke because they didn't leave records, but people do speak, and I think they still speak.
But that's true. People do speak. As if there is a contemporaneous record, some people claim that they have spoken in their memoirs. A lot of people who write their memoirs and claim that they have spoken. But I know, for example, they have not spoken. But anyway, Barkha, your point is there are some issues that continue to be in part of the public discourse today, which are there in the book. Jammu and Kashmir certainly is one issue. The Uniform Civil Code. Mr. Haksar was a great Nehru Bhakt, great Nehruvian, prided himself on being a Nehruvian, but he said Nehru made an error in not forcing the Uniform Civil Code in the early 50s. That continues to be part of the public discourse. Secularism, this whole notion of secularism, and Haksar takes the position long after, he takes this position even during Indira Gandhi's time, but long after he's left Indira Gandhi, he continues to take the position that this Sarva Dharma Samabhav and Dharma Nirpekshata is all hogwash. The secularism is really the state not taking position in favor of religion A or religion B. We are a religious society. Religion should be a matter of private choice, private practice. The state has no business. That's the classic liberal definition of secularism. That continues to.
I'd like to believe Mr. Haksar would have supported Rashtrapati Bhavan's decision to not celebrate any religious festivals
he
in
would
a
have,
state building.
He would have welcomed it, not to celebrate. He told Indira Gandhi, do not celebrate 16th of December as Vijay Divas. That was the day in which Pakistan surrendered to India, this 16th of December. And he writes a long note to Mrs. Gandhi, do not celebrate Vijay Divas. However, that advice was disregarded. And now we have Vijay Divas 1 and Vijay Divas 2.
But that's not the same thing as the secularism.
I'm just as an example. Yeah, but secularism, absolutely. He would have been 100% behind the decision.
So Ashok, were you the
any-
Haksar behind that decision?
No, not at all. When he took office, it was absolutely his decision. But perhaps he may have been influenced by the debates which Jairam refers to, because he's went through much of that period. But it was entirely his decision.
So let's come to something that I think is real. You think it's a good
I think it's
decision?
a great decision. Not to celebrate any religious festival, irrespective of religion, and not to give the official sanction. The president, in his capacity as Ramnath Kovind, can celebrate any festival he wants. But the president of India, keeping himself aloof, I think is a decision. It goes back to the debate on the Somnath temple. When Rajendra Prasad wanted to go for the consecration of the Somnath temple, and Nehru writes to him saying, Rajendra Prasad can go, but the president of India better not go.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit, Jairam, and talk a little bit about the whole, what we get to know about Indira's relationship with her sons. Not too much, but this is really a valuable sort of material in these letters. And I actually have one of those letters open where Indira Gandhi says that is actually worrying about something that something could happen to her. And this is in 1971. So in 1971, she's actually worried that something could happen to her, and she doesn't have much to leave her children except a few shares and some jewelry for the prospective daughter-in-laws. And then she says that she'd like it to be evenly divided, but she's actually really worried because at least Rajiv has a job and Sanjay doesn't. And I'll just read that the last line before I ask Jairam to talk about it. And she's talking about Sanjay Gandhi being a lot like her. And that's interesting that Indira Gandhi actually identifies more with Sanjay and writes to P. N. Haksar, he is so much like I was at his age, rough edges and all, that my heart aches for the suffering he may have to bear. The problem is, where will they live and how? I can only hope and trust for the best, but I hope the boys will feel that they're not quite alone and they have someone to lean on. This is very interesting. And this Sanjay Gandhi vulnerability proves to be the undoing of this relationship between Indira and Haksar.
Well, not only have I not been judgmental in this book, but I have also not indulged in the favorite pastime of psychohistory, trying to psychoanalyze motives and decisions that form part of the book. I mean, you can write a book on that letter.
Yeah.
You can really write a book on that letter. Yeah. And that letter reveals a lot. It reveals the relationship that Indira Gandhi had with Sanjay Gandhi. Well, the roots of I must say that the only negative reaction I've had to this book so far is from Varun Gandhi, who tweeted as soon as this book came out and some extracts were published. He tweeted, an accidental politician writing about a failed bureaucrat. Little does he know that India's most successful enterprise was the Maruti project. I mean, this was the only negative. Obviously, a lot of these things must have hit home because Sanjay Gandhi figures as the Mephistophelian figure in this book. There are two things. One is in 1965, Sanjay Gandhi is going through a 4-year program at Rolls-Royce Technical College. At the end of 2 years, he decides he knows everything that is to be known, and he decides to drop out and come back to India because Mrs. Gandhi has become Prime Minister by then. Mrs. Gandhi then writes to Mr. Haksar, and I've reproduced that letter, saying that please meet Sanjay and convince him to continue with his studies. Haksar meets Sanjay Gandhi in 1965 and obviously fails to convince Sanjay Gandhi. And Sanjay Gandhi then writes to his mother saying that Haksar met me, but he just doesn't listen to me. He keeps telling me to continue this course. And I've learned all that there is to be learned. And I'm wasting my time. I'm just sitting there doing nothing. So he comes back. So obviously the chemistry hadn't worked out between Sanjay Gandhi and Mr. Haksar. But more importantly, I think more substantively, the roots of the drift with Indira Gandhi started with the rift with Sanjay Gandhi. And the rift was occasioned by the Maruti project of young Mr. Gandhi. In December 68, he unveils his plan to become the Henry Ford of India, to produce people's car, small car. And by September of 1970, he becomes the only person to get a letter of intent to manufacture the small people's car. From 68 onwards, Mr. Haksar is telling the Prime Minister two things. One, India does not require a passenger car. We already have 3 passenger car manufacturers, Ambassador, Fiat, and Standard Motors. India does not need. We are scarce resources. We should not be investing in passenger cars. We should be investing in public transport. Secondly, so the first is unexceptionable. No Prime Minister will find it objectionable. The second bit of advice he gives, and for a diplomat, I think he was quite undiplomatic when it came to this advice. He told her that a Prime Minister's son cannot stay in the Prime Minister's house and carrying on a business enterprise with quote-unquote less than desirable characters. And that, I think, wrote his epitaph for him. There was this... The Maruti project really was a shadow over the relationship. What happens in March 71 is that Indira Gandhi gets a spectacular 2/3 mandate. Spectacular. That's not, it's an understatement of the year. In 1967, Mrs. Gandhi led the Congress party and she got 282 seats. It shows how much politics has moved in India in the last 50 years. That in 1967, the headlines were Congress crashes to a defeat, only 282 seats. In 2014, the headline was Modi sweeps the country, 282 seats. Exactly 282. In 67, 282 in 2014. But in 67, she was seen to have completely devastated the Congress party. But in 71, Barkha, she comes back with a spectacular two-thirds mandate, and the Economist calls her the Empress of India. Then from March 71 to December 71, we have this crisis with Pakistan leading to the emergence of Bangladesh. And on the 17th of December 1971, Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee calls Indira Gandhi Durga. Now, gone is the Indira Gandhi of 67, who needed a Haksar.
Yeah.
Gone is the Indira Gandhi, tentative, cautious, uncertain, worried about Kamaraj, worried about Nijlingappa, worried about somebody else. We now have an Empress of India. We now have a Durga, two-thirds mandate in her own right, spectacular victory in the war with Pakistan. And Mr. Haksar reads the writing on the wall. And from 71 onwards, he has been planning his own retirement, planning his own exit. In fact, contrary to what all biographers of Indira Gandhi have written, including Catherine Frank and Inder Malhotra, Indira Gandhi did not sack Mr. Haksar. Mr. Haksar wrote his own departure. He asked to be relieved of his duties in the Prime Minister's Secretariat in December of 72. She did not make an effort to keep him back because I think by then it had been abundantly clear that the rising political star was Mr. Sanjay Gandhi. The best description of this was provided by Mr. Sharda Prasad. And
The
this
Chamberlain
description
and the
I owe to Mr. Sharda Prasad's son, who is sitting here, Ravi. And Mr. Sharda Prasad wrote an article, an obituary of Mr. Haksar in 1998. Very difficult to get hold of the obituary, but thanks to Ravi, I was able to get it. And there's a wonderful description of what happened between Indira Gandhi and Haksar. Mr. Sharda Prasad, who incidentally was the only man to be with Indira Gandhi from the first day as Prime Minister till the last day as Prime Minister, Mr. Sharda Prasad writes, in the struggle between the sovereign and the chamberlain, the prince won. I think that was a brilliantly well put description of what happened. And that's really what happened.
Ashok, can I get you in on one of the interesting details in this book, which is just one sentence, but again, it really struck me, was how Haksar is linked to a decision to de-link state assembly elections from national elections. I mean, I just found that so interesting how life keeps turning full circle, right? And at that time, there is actually a political reasoning. It isn't just a, right, Jairam? There's a political reasoning.
Political reasoning was this, Barkha. I know that you ultimately have to reduce a work of historical
Oh, come
scholarship to everything.
At least it
to
shows you.
today's-
At least it shows you
to
how carefully I've
today's-
read the
I
book.
know, I mean, I understand your compulsions, but but let us.
these are interesting
It's
things.
very interesting
Yeah.
that till 1967, elections were held together. The elections got delinked in 1971. And the reason why they got delinked was in December of 1970. In January of 1970, the Supreme Court struck down the law relating to the nationalization of banks. And that was the first bugle that was sounded by the Supreme Court. In December of 1970, the Supreme Court strikes down the presidential proclamation on the abolition of privy purses and princely privileges. And it is within a few days, a decision is taken by Haksar, Kumaramangalam, C. Subramaniam, and of course Indira Gandhi, that we must go to the polls. We must go to the people, saying that this is a subversion of all our progressive policies. And there is no thought about simultaneous election. It was a thought about Indira Gandhi, getting power. So that was the background.
Yeah,
there.
yeah, of course.
Other point I want to make, Barkha, because this judiciary executive relationship is very, very important. And we often tend to forget our own history. What happens in 1967? People blame Haksar, Indira Gandhi, and Kumaramangalam for the deteriorating relationship between the judiciary and the executive. But please see what happens in April 1967. In April 1967, presidential polls are announced. Dr. Zakir Hussain is the candidate of the Congress party to succeed Dr. Radhakrishnan. And who do you think was the joint opposition candidate for the presidential polls? It was a sitting Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, not a retired Chief Justice. No, he was retiring 3 months later. But when you go and offer him the job, he was a sitting Chief Justice. A sitting Chief Justice, of course, he resigns. He had to resign. He resigned 3 months before his retirement. But I found it very interesting that, and I firmly believe that from that day on, the atmosphere had got vitiated. And of course, then nationalization of banks and the other decisions come. And another continuity to add to your list of Kashmir, to your uniform civil code, is the simultaneous election idea.
That's why. Share how much of it was illustrative or relatable to small things that you would never have understood being outside of government till you actually, as a government would be, the establishment.
See, my one learning, I'm spent 1 year at a peripheral position somewhere in a corner, but so I can't comment on with great authority. But my one learning, which this book has borne out as well, is that many of the decisions we think are spur of the moment or political decisions taken on the basis of last week's politics actually have a gestation period going back much, much longer in the system, including in an interplay of what a civil servant thinks, how he shapes his or her ideas and his or her sense of what is good for the country within the framework of his or her political master's politics. He can't operate independent of that. However, he can't completely surrender to that as well if he has a backbone. So it's that interplay which is fascinating to watch, which is fascinating to read, which is fascinating to understand, and which cannot reduce itself to a black and white, so and so is political, so and so is not political. It's much more complex. And frankly, I don't even know if I can ever get to the depth of it, or anyone can. Jairam, your... if you look at what Mrs. Gandhi was doing, when she replaces, in this open book, when she replaces LK Jha with, after devaluation, turns out to be a fiasco. The 900 million does not come from the US. 900 million. And there's a line here that she wants people who are not just offering good economic reformist ideas, but who are perhaps more sensitive to politics or political exigencies. Now again, it's that process continues forever and ever, and it also tells us that Indira Gandhi was not a captive of this left-wing Kashmiri clique. She chose that clique. So obviously her ideas resonated. Now whether her ideas resonated or whether she felt that was a route to consolidating power is another matter. It's another matter. Okay, because I think politicians or political parties look at ideas, but they also look at power.
Yeah.
And that stands to reason, because without power, how can you take forward ideas? So now, does power become more of an imperative than the ideas? Perhaps at some stages.
Yeah. I have a last question, then I think we should take questions. In the end, despite this fallout something quite serious happens, right? P.N. Haksar actually gets accused or has his integrity questioned, where there's this suggestion of him having bought land, right? That at cheap throwaway rates that is later very valuable, etc. Despite this, and despite his stinging rebuttal to it, later, he does write to Indira again, and you say in the author's voice that some people could regard this as sycophancy, but this man was not a sycophant. So you have to understand the complexity of this relationship. Can you talk a little bit about that? What makes someone like Haksar, in your research of him, reach out again to somebody who has basically called him corrupt after all the years that he spends by her side?
I think it was the dear Induji syndrome, going back to the mid 30s, going back to the fact that he was basically Nehru's creation. He owed his career in the MEA to Nehru, who got him into the MEA when he was 34 years old. And frankly, without Indira Gandhi, Haksar would have retired as High Commissioner to London or at most ambassador to the USSR. And it's Indira Gandhi who plucks him out of diplomatic obscurity and gives him this larger than life figure, which he acquires very soon. So there must have been some recognition of that gratitude towards Indira Gandhi. He saw Indira Gandhi as ultimately for all her. He saw her as Sanjay's mother, who victimized him, but he also saw her as Nehru's daughter, who called for elections in January 1977 when nobody expected that she would call. And from November 79, there's a wonderful letter from him to Arjun Sengupta, who was then in Oxford University. And long before Pranay Roy and Ashok Lahiri predicted the return of Indira Gandhi in 1980, which was the India Today. In fact, India Today made its reputation because of that poll, which nobody expected Indira Gandhi to win with such a spectacular margin. And Mr. Haksar is writing to Arjun Sengupta saying that, the elections are around the corner and Indira Gandhi is going to come back, with a huge margin. And then he writes this extraordinary letter to Indira Gandhi, welcoming her back. When I say that this could be read as a sycophantic letter. In fact, at the same time that he wrote to her, Justice P.N. Bhagwati also had written to Indira Gandhi, and Bhagwati's letter has become a permanent millstone around Bhagwati's memory and Bhagwati's legacy. But Bhagwati was still had, to become Chief Justice. Mr. Haksar had seen the days of power. I think. See, there are many things that I have not been able to explain.
Yeah.
Why did he continue with Indira Gandhi in spite of the fact that his house was raided twice, his wife's shop was raided, his brother-in-law was arrested, his uncle was arrested, his wife was almost arrested.
Yeah.
Why did he continue? And Indira Gandhi gives an interview to Mary Karras in the Illustrated Weekly, basically saying that Mr. Haksar, was involved in a land scam in Gurgaon. The land next to Maruti. I mean, this was obviously. And then that was the only occasion in which Indira Gandhi spoke out publicly against Mr. Haksar. And that was the only occasion in which Mr. Haksar spoke out, defend himself. I think he was deeply, deeply, deeply committed to Indira Gandhi. I think that's the bottom line. If you ask me, what was his strength? Indira Gandhi. What was his weakness? Indira Gandhi. And somebody asked me this question that isn't it bad for a civil servant to be committed to an individual like this? Well, there was a certain history, there was a certain legacy, but Mr. Haksar could carry off that loyalty because he was able to tell Indira Gandhi where she was going wrong. And the only analogy I can draw is the analogy of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi brought religion into Indian politics in a big way. But he handled beautifully, he handled it wonderfully. But in the hands of a Bal Thackeray or a Uma Bharati or a Yogi Adityanath, the bringing religion into politics becomes a dangerous cocktail. So in the hands of Haksar, he could manage professional integrity and personal loyalty, but in people less and better endowed than him, it became a recipe for sycophancy. And that's what really happened to Indira Gandhi.
Okay, fascinating. Let's open this for questions, comments. Sir, please.
Very small question. Since Mr. Haksar was such a wise man and gave good advice, etc., this 71 war, which I also fought, one of my 4 wars, uh, how come we gave away 93,000 prisoners of war, got nothing strategic in return, notwithstanding the advice of the armed forces that you don't give away so many people? And wasn't this ever thought of? Was it spur of the moment? Was it the charm of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto that Indira Gandhi was taken in? Since you've done such a good study, why?
So please read the book, because I have dealt with this extensively. Not only have I dealt with 72, but I've also dealt with 71 extensively. And this wonderful story that one of the most colorful Indians, Field Marshal Manekshaw, has wonderfully spread in our country, that Mrs. Gandhi was just waiting to go into Bangladesh, and he, General Manekshaw, had to tell her, don't do now, do it later. This is hogwash. The evidence suggests completely the opposite. The evidence suggests caution from March till August, till the Indo-Soviet treaty becomes a reality, a little bit of ramping up of the rhetoric, but all along building up military capacity, all along building up military capability. We should not forget the role of another Kashmiri Pandit in 1971, which is Mr. R.N. Kao, who plays a very important role in the building of the Mukti Bahini. You're laughing on this Kashmiri Pandit. There is a cartoon in this book, a man reading a newspaper, and the headline in the newspaper is Kashmiris must have their say. And in the table, there are nameplates: PN Dhar, PN Haksar, DP Dhar, TN Kaul. Of course, Mr. Cow was missing. And the best part of it is that the man who drew the cartoon was also a Kashmiri Pandit. Sudhir Dhar. So 1972, I have dealt exactly with this question. Did Haksar win the war and lose the peace? Sir, with due respect, historical scholarship cannot, retrospective angst about what might have happened with Pakistan cannot be a substitute for historical evidence and historical scholarship. The fact of the matter is that Manekshaw gave advice that on territory there were conflicting advice. But on 93,000 prisoners of war, Manekshaw gave clear advice that they are useless from India's point of view. However, your point remains. On the territory, there were divergent viewpoints. P.N. Dhar had one viewpoint, P.N. Haksar had another viewpoint, and finally the Haksar viewpoint prevailed. And I have explained why it prevailed. But you have a fair point. I mean, I'm not running away
If I
from it.
could just take a moment here. The Q&A is between the author and the audience. I'd like to take your leave now. Thank you very much, Jairam. Congratulations on 5 years or 4.5 years of, what, 6 or 7 books, including...
Ashok is now a true full-blooded civil servant. He comes in late and leaves early.
But I wish you many more books over the next 5 years. This one final question. So there's one line here where Haksar is going to be posted to South Africa. Is that correct? He had a mission in South Africa?
No, we had, but that's not true. I checked on this. It is true that Girija Shankar Bajpai, did give him a posting to South Africa. However, as he came out of Girija Shankar Bajpai's room, he was waylaid or accosted by Krishna Menon. And since Haksar was the only man who could get along with Krishna Menon said, "You're coming with me to London." And that's how we went to London. But it is true that his orders were never issued. But he was to go to South Africa.
So we considered a mission in South Africa.
Yeah. We had a consulate, actually. We had a consulate.
Okay, ma'am.
I just wanted to say something about 71 thing that you said. I was just reading something yesterday by Ashok Parthasarthi about something he's writing about his father, GP. He says that at this meeting, Indira Gandhi had called a meeting about what they should do about after Bangladesh, whether they should go to, march into Pakistan. She asked General Manekshaw, are we prepared? And General Manekshaw, yes, 3 days, we can march into Peshawar. I mean, I don't know whether this is all true or not. And Haksar apparently opposed this and said, no, I would not advise this at all. We have to think about it. What are the consequences of our going into Pakistan? And apparently many people in the room, some senior ministers, Jagjeevan Ramodar, I think defense minister there and so on, were of the view that we should go in. But Haksar was very firm. And then Indira said, so what you said is right, that Indira didn't want to go in. She said, this is something very serious and we have to think about it very carefully. And so probably she was guided by what Haksar said. I don't know whether this whole, Ashok said that he was present at this meeting where GP was there and several other people were there and so on.
Ma'am, I would strongly urge you not to. I would urge you to read Ashok Parthasarathi, but not to believe one word of what he writes. There is no primary evidence for any of the claims that he makes. He makes outlandish claims regarding himself. He was in Indira Gandhi's office. Haksar recruited him, at the young age of 29. And he makes astounding claims for what he told Indira Gandhi, which is simply not borne out. And that level of astonishment extends even to GP's role. However, the fact remains that Mr. Haksar was dead opposed to India expanding the war on the Western Front. Let me also say that Indira Gandhi was dead opposed to expanding the war on the Western Front. And the reason for this is that Mr. Cow and Mr. Haksar had said from day one that we have a strong case as far as East Pakistan is concerned. We have 10 million refugees, and more importantly, we have local militia, we have local guerrilla fighters. We have the Mukti Bahini, the Mukti Fauj, Tajuddin Ahmad, various people. In West Pakistan, we do not have, in Punjab, we do not have a similar internal group waiting for India to come and rescue them from Pakistan. Number one. Number two, the international support for India was on East Pakistan. It was not on West Pakistan. And number three, we should never forget this, the USSR would not have countenanced the breakup of West Pakistan. The USSR went with us from August 1971 as far as East Pakistan was concerned. But West Pakistan would have been a complete no-no internationally. And I think they knew it. I think General Manekshaw also knew it.
Okay, yes.
My name is Rajiv Saxena. I've been your great friend, courtesy my wife, who used to work in Planning Commission. She was from the 1980s. Many of the classmates were really awed by your personality when you used to work over there. My questions are three. The one of them, recently I read a book by Mr. Khushwant Singh. And in this book, written by Mr. Khushwant Singh, the name of the book is 99, which has been edited by her actual son-in-law and daughter. I think you must have also seen that book. Major part of your book, what you have just described, I have read in that book, number one. And in which, sir, please read that book.
Acha, what is your question?
The question is, the reason was Mr. P.N. Haksar was interviewed by Mr. Krishnaswamy, but later in the years, I'm so told that they moved apart. Is it true or false? Number two, sir, I've recently become a student of the history, but I couldn't find any book on the role of the Indians in shaping the new world after the very first World War and the Second World War. My request to you, very humble request, that if you can write the contribution of the Indian forces, which has not been duly acknowledged anywhere in the world, on the role of the Indians as far as fighting the two wars. Okay. It should be a British Empire war rather than the British war. Thank you.
Well, let me deal with the Khushwant Singh question, because I've read Khushwant Singh's books extensively. Khushwant Singh's autobiography is called Truth, Love, and a Little Bit of Malice. It actually should have been called Falsehoods, Lust, and a little bit of truth, because it is completely bereft of any relation to reality. He writes, Mr. Haksar was interviewed by Harold Lasky in London. Crap. The archivals, I've quoted the archives, he was interviewed by Girija Shankar Vajpayee in India in 1948 for induction into the Foreign Service. He makes a series of, he's eminently readable. People who are eminently readable sometimes also become eminently unbelievable. And Khushwant Singh is one of them. And particularly about this period of the 50s, because he had a visceral hatred for Krishna Menon. He had a visceral hatred for, he worked in Yojana, he came to the Planning Commission, he was editor of Yojana, he didn't quite settle down. Mr. Sharda Prasad then took over from him. So I'm afraid, this is the difference between myths that get spread and actual reality. The myth is that Lasky did this and Lasky did that. The archives tell you a different story. So my advice to any historian, young or middle-aged or old, unless you find written evidence, do not believe what you hear. Because I think amongst all people in the world, we are the world's greatest reinventors of truth. And we believe what we want to believe.
Okay, Ravi.
No, I was really struck by what you had said, that a civil servant, you really get to know his character after he retires. And Haksar, of course, had a very difficult time. His pension was only 700 rupees a month. And what kept him going were his hobbies, cooking and photography. He was a marvelous cook. And in fact, he and Indira Gandhi would exchange all these recipes of what should be served to the foreign guests. In fact, most of the menus for the foreign guests were designed by Haksar. And he had this vast things of friendships with people who were young enough to be his grandchildren, such as me. And you also should, have written about his photography, his interest in wildlife, photography, cooking, cuisine that kept him going. And also that after retirement, his role in the various, for instance, the Cultural Academy, Sangeet Natak Academy, Sahitya Academy, and this being associated with so many different intellectual institutions.
Yeah, I mean, the large number of institutions, JNU. Yes. He was Chancellor of JNU for 5 years. Delhi Science Forum. He was, various public causes. He became the patron saint of all public causes. The Bhopal gas tragedy. He played a very important role for encouraging democracy in Burma, in Myanmar. I mean, I haven't written about that, but I've alluded to it. But he plays a very important role in getting youngsters from Myanmar, and his house became sort of the adda for all these pro-democracy activists. So in many ways, Ravi, after retirement, he discovered a completely different role.
He became the voice of conscience of the nation after retirement.
He became a sort of a conscience keeper. And other than the fact that Rajiv Gandhi sent him to China, he had really no official locus standi, but he would give advice. He advised Rajiv Gandhi that the Shabanu thing was a disaster. He advised him against the defamation bill. You may remember the 1988-89 episode on the defamation bill. So he spoke out. I mean, I think that's what people who have had long years in the corridors of power, should speak out when they have an opportunity. Absolutely.
Yeah. The other thing you'd also mentioned was about the Subbarao, Justice Subbarao. And I think after that, Haksar was the one who said, we should get committed judges. No, I mean committed in the sense of socially progressive judges who were not conservative, but who had a social conscience. And I think that's when they started picking the judiciary.
See, the word commitment became
that's the problem. He really meant judges who had a socialist point of view and who were not conservative.
See, to Haksar and to Kumaramangalam, commitment meant commitment to progressive ideology, commitment to the constitution. But after Haksar left and Kumaramangalam left, commitment became commitment to one individual. And that's what happened.
Yeah, here first. Yeah.
Exactly. So on the economic...
let him just go and then you... Or it doesn't matter, whichever one of you.
Is there any evidence which shows that on economic ideology, economic orientation, Did he ever have regrets or second thoughts in later years when he was out of power? What I'm getting to is who would be the kind of eminent academics or ideologically oriented people who thought differently regarding socialism, regarding Soviet Union, regarding some of the turns that Mrs. Gandhi's policies took? You know, in the Rajaji tradition, who were the kind of people whom he respected?
Rajaji was the only public figure. And Mr. Haksar remained an unrepentant public sector wala, unrepentant Marxist, unrepentant friend and admirer. One of the last articles he writes on Gorbachev, which I have quoted. Great admirer of Gorbachev, and telling Rajiv Gandhi that he should be the Gorbachev of India, both for Glasnost and for Perestroika. Rajaji was certainly one figure. If you read my book, you will find a very interesting episode that takes place in 1974 and in 1975. In October 74 and in March of 1975, the chief economic advisor in the Ministry of Finance sends Mr. Haksar 2 detailed notes on how to make changes in India's economic policy. And that chief economic advisor was Dr. Manmohan Singh. But the politics of the 70s did not allow Dr. Manmohan Singh's recommendations to see the light of day. But, I have quoted from those 2 papers. So there were people in government. Jagdish Bhagwati, outside government. Dr. Manmohan Singh, in government. I.G. Patel had left. He had joined the UN by then. But Rajaji, of course, was the great, proponent of what happened after 1991.
Yeah, if I could just intervene on this. For instance, you've spoken about Haksar's patronage of I.G. Patel. And he also brought in P.M. Dhar, who also was a liberalizer. And I think Haksar, even though he's a proponent of the public sector, he did recognize that there had to be liberalization, and that's why he brought in people who were opposed to him, such as I.G. Patel and P.M. Dhar especially, who was brought in to liberalize the economy. Of course, the politics went against that, and there was a leaked note which led to about liberalization. Then the fierce political backlash against Indira Gandhi, efforts to liberalize the economy. Otherwise, we could have had a 1991 and 1974 itself. I think Haksar realized that we needed that Gorbachev kind of figure, and if the political backlash was not there, we might have had a liberalization in 1974 at the instance of Haksar, who himself was a proponent of the public sector, but realized that we needed liberalization.
Yeah, sir.
What should be the ideal relationship between bureaucrat and a politician? You had been a bureaucrat, you had been politician, you had been technocrat, you had been in PMO also, and planning commission.
Good question.
Your experience, in fact.
Well, as a bureaucrat, I believed in speaking my mind.
You were, in fact,
As a
not
politician, I expected my bureaucrats to speak their mind.
Right.
My civil servants differed with me on many things, but I said, your job is to tell me what the options are, and you tell me the options that you prefer. My job is either to agree with you or to overrule you. So in many cases, particularly when I was environment minister, my bureaucracy came up with certain ideas which I didn't agree. But I said, my job is for you to give you the protection
Right.
to express your views. My job is not to prejudge. The trouble is 9 cases out of 10. The bureaucracy tends to sense which way
The wind
is blowing and then tailor the advice to that wind. No, that's, you have to, by the way, all these files are now open because of RTI. You will find on many decisions,
Disagreements.
Lavasa.
Yeah.
Lavasa. The ministry took one view, I overruled their view, and I gave my reasons why I overruled. That should be the relationship between a politician and a civil servant. The civil servant should have the freedom to speak his mind or her mind, to put it on a piece of paper. The politician must have the courage to either agree or to disagree. However, the difference is when you agree, you can sign. When you disagree, you must give your reasoning why you are disagreeing. You cannot simply say, I disagree, and then help after that.
What really happens is that you go and change the notes.
Sorry?
What happens
happens is that when you disagree, you say you go and change the law.
Yeah, that also happens. Many times, in many files, you find pages stuck on each other. You find that also. That is also there. But I think one of the things that, this is not a commercial for myself, but one of the things I did as environment minister was to institute the system of a speaking order. And I think every minister must follow this. This is like what the judges do.
Yeah.
You give a speaking order. This is my order. This is what the facts of the case are. This is what the recommendation is, and this is why I agree or disagree. I think the speaking order thing will bring about greater professionalism in relation between the civil service and the politician. The civil servants will feel that they are being heard, and the politician will have the courage to agree or disagree later.
Okay.
I was saying one aspect, I haven't read the book as yet because I was out, is about his role in India League in London before the independence. Now, that has had a very major impact on his later years. He was already working with Krishna Menon for years, and he was inducted in 1950. After that, of course, he was in various embassies and postings abroad. But by the time he comes back, the whole thing comes back, and the whole group comes back. So that, I hope you've covered that. Yeah.
With this, extensively, finding a job for his red friends from London, because they're all part of a cabal, and almost all of them are Bengalis. And, these are all upper class people from, upper class families, going to England to study, going either to Cambridge, Oxford, or the London School of Economics. In fact, Eric Hobsbawm has a wonderful paragraph in his memoirs where he says, I found all my Indian friends came from upper class and upper caste backgrounds, and how privileged they were. Mohan Kumar Mangalam, Bhupesh Gupta, Jyoti Basu, Indrajit Gupta, Shelvankar, so many people, K.T. Chandy, S.S. Dhawan, Mr. Haksar himself. So he found a job for all the boy. But that period is very important. That period is a progressive period. And one political fallout of the 1930s, which became part of politics of the 1960s, and in many ways became part of UPA 1 and UPA 2. In the 1930s, Sanat, there was an idea called the Popular Front. The Popular Front meant that all parties that were opposed to fascists and opposed to the Nazis would form a government. So communists would be part of the government, Labour would be farmer. In France, there was a Popular Front government. In Spain, there was a Popular Front government. In England, there was a Popular Front government. And one of the great takeaways, what I see for Mr. Haksar from his 1930s sojourn in London, is the notion of a broad progressive front. And this is what happens in 1969 when the Congress splits. The CPI begins to support the Congress. The CPM supports the Congress. The DMK supports the Congress. So bringing together all progressive forces. That time, of course, the focal point was opposition to Swatantra and Jansangh. Now the opposition, for the BJP is opposition to the Congress. For the Congress is opposition to the BJP. So this notion of a popular front is very, very important. And this becomes, in many ways, the UPA is a popular front idea.
Okay, last question.
Also, I have spoken about the very key role that Haksar played in the Congress split of 1969. He was really responsible for the rout of the syndicate and responsible for Indira Gandhi's left wing.
For the last question. Because I think we're on 2 o'clock and we have to end. Yes, sir.
I haven't read the book, sir. But my question relates to, again, the relations between bureaucrats and the ministers. So, one thing I will say that, as you have mentioned, that bureaucrats may come out with their advice and they can be overruled. But once they are overruled, it is their responsibility and their job to implement the decision as taken by the government rather than being lukewarm towards the decision because they did not agree initially with the decision. That apart, sir, I will just talking about the influence of bureaucrats on minister or prime minister. Of course, Mr. Haksar, you have what was the influence of Mr. G. Parthasarathi on Mrs. Gandhi? Especially, I'm asking this in the context of the package deal offered by China in 1984. which I believe she could not agree under the advice, or did not agree because of Mr. Parthasarthi's advice, as it may not have been able to sell it to the, I mean, electorally, it may not have been possible to accept.
Evidence now that's coming out that this so-called package deal goes back to 1960 and Chow En-lai's visit to New Delhi in 1960. Frankly, the package deal was unacceptable to Govind Vallabh Pant. It was unacceptable to Morarji Desai. It was unacceptable to the Vice President of India, Dr. Radhakrishnan, at that point of time. So, and Nehru, and it was unacceptable, by the way, to Parliament, because Parliament in 1960 was egging the Prime Minister to evict the Chinese from territory that India they believed was Indian, that the Chinese were holding on to. So this package deal, the 1982 package deal of Deng Xiaoping actually goes back to Chow En-lai in 1960. But today the package deal has completely lost its meaning because Tawang has become a new factor. Tawang was not a factor in the package deal. But now the Chinese are insisting on sovereignty over Tawang, which India can never compromise on. So the goalpost has changed. So the package deal is a matter of historical interest. But the fact is that, contrary to what Ashok Parthasarthi writes, G. Parthasarthi was one of the... G. Parthasarthi and P.V. Narasimha Rao were two people who were very, very skeptical of any normalization of relations with China in the 1980s. And it took Mr. Rajiv Gandhi to become Prime Minister, Mr. Haksar's visit to Beijing, and then Mr. Narayan Dutt Tiwari as Foreign Minister went to Beijing. So it was difficult for Indira Gandhi because people around Indira Gandhi, particularly G. Parthasarthi and others, were telling her that the Chinese had betrayed Mr. Nehru and there's no point doing a deal or an agreement with the Chinese. This is a matter of historical interest.
Okay, I do have to close, but you want to squeeze in a quick question?
Just two questions. First, regarding this period that you're talking about from 67 to 73, is also something that you've written about in the last book, which is biography of Indira Gandhi. So I wanted to just link it up to that and ask you whether did Haksar play a part in our ecological sort of policies as well, as is reflected in, you wrote about them in the cover draft of his Stockholm speech. And also the second question, I want to link it up with your own tenure as the environmental minister and ask, would I be correct in assuming that your own ideas about environment sort of somewhat reflect this period's ecological consciousness and ecological balance that you played a part in Copenhagen?
Well, Haksar had virtually no influence on Indira Gandhi, the ecologist. Indira Gandhi was a born ecologist. Ecology came to her naturally. It came to her naturally because she studied in Switzerland, she studied in Shantiniketan, she was in prison, variety of influences on her, ecological influences, and she became India's first and last Prime Minister to take ecology seriously as a matter of governance. And Mr. Haksar, other than drafting the famous Stockholm speech, had really no influence on the Wildlife Protection Act or the Water Pollution Control Act or the Air Pollution Control Act or the Forest Conservation Act. This is one area in which Indira Gandhi didn't depend on any advisor. This is one area in which she was very, very committed. She was knowledgeable. And in fact, she was one step ahead of the bureaucracy when it came to matters relating to environment, culture, those areas. Well, my own experience as environment minister, I was deeply influenced by Indira Gandhi's making environment and ecological balance a matter of political discourse. She sets up the Ministry of Environment, and then she sets up all the pollution control boards in the state and at the center. And in fact, today, the laws that we have for protecting the environment, the Wildlife Protection Act, the Air Pollution Control Act, the Water Pollution Control Act, the Forest Conservation Act, were done during her time. The Ministry of Environment, she was India's first Minister of Environment. She was minister for 4 years till she was assassinated. The Central Pollution Control Board, the State Pollution Control Board were created during her time. So actually she was, if there was one area where she was an unusual visionary, it was on ecology. She's talking of climate change and deforestation in the early 70s. when it was not the fashion. And in Stockholm, I'll just leave you with this one thought. In Stockholm, recently we had the Paris summit on climate change in 2015, where there were 90 heads of state, including our Prime Minister, who were present. 90 heads of state. In Stockholm, in the first UN conference of the human environment in June of 1972, there was only one visiting head of state. There were only two heads of state who attended. One had to attend because he was the host, Olaf Palme. And the only other head of state to go to the UN conference was Indira Gandhi. This was way back in 1972. So in 40 years, things have moved very dramatically when it comes to environment.
Thank you, Jairam. It is a fascinating book. I often argue with Jairam on many things, but this was a book that kept me up at night. It really was an interesting read. So thank you very much. Round of applause for Jairam Ramesh and his brilliant new book.